Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of, owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, for God's glory and that of his kingdom. We are delighted to have with us to drill down on one of the most important issues of our time, our nuclear challenges, notably from Vladimir Putin, but from others as well. Whether we are in a position to do something about those threats, and if not, what are the prospects for the unthinkable, as it's been called, actual nuclear war? Our guest is Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, no stranger to this audience, or frankly, I think to most of the rest of the world at this point. He has been featured prominently, among other places, on Mark Levin's terrific Life, Liberty, and Levin program on Fox News. But he's the author of a number of really important books, including, I think most recently, Blackout Wars and the Power and the Light. He has been very active in the public policy arena, going back to his time as an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, his time on Capitol Hill and various capacities there as a professional staff member, and on several really important national commissions looking at the threats to our electric grid and the adequacy of our strategic nuclear forces. He is a man of many parts. We're always delighted to have him, and a special welcome as a member of our cast of characters as a senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy. Peter Pry, it's good to have you back. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me, Frank.
A lot to talk with you about, Peter. Most especially, I want to visit about the prospect that we are actually facing a possibly imminent nuclear war at the hands of Vladimir Putin of Russia. In the midst of all of this Ukraine business, he has been intensifying the readiness of his nuclear forces and making not so concealed threats to use them. Talk about that threat as you see it, Peter, both in terms of capabilities, which are easier to assess, but also intentions, as best we can establish those.
Yeah, on February 27th, a couple of Sundays ago, Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia, announced that he was putting his nuclear forces on a special combat alert, and then went down into one of the deep underground shelters, of which there are hundreds in Russia. These are hundreds of meters deep under solid granite, and they're impervious to nuclear attack and can accommodate up to 30,000 Russian elites. The Biden administration has basically tried to cover up the fact that I believe we're in a nuclear crisis with Russia that's more serious than the Cuban Missile Crisis. The administration has denied clear evidence of the Russian high alert of its nuclear forces because I think it doesn't want to admit to the American people that their Ukraine policies have brought us to a brink of nuclear war with Russia. And they would have to explain what are the vital U.S. national interests that make this risk worthwhile. Some of the evidence of Russian mobilization was just before their invasion of Ukraine, they conducted a major strategic forces exercise called Thunder. And unusually, the reentry vehicles from their missiles, these weren't live warheads, but they were dummy warheads that they normally launch in exercises. And this was an exercise of strategic as well as theater and tactical nuclear systems, called Thunder or Grom in the Russian. Normally, they would send these reentry vehicles to the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is out on the Pacific side of Russia, and it's a remote area far away from any other country. But this exercise was conducted in the Arctic Ocean off of northern Europe. And so the reentry vehicles were falling in to an area that was uncomfortably close to the NATO alliance. In Russian military doctrine, you can use a military exercise to cover the mobilization of forces, and that's almost certainly what they did. Curiously, our intelligence community, while they understood that the Russian mobilization of their conventional forces was for the invasion of Ukraine, and so it concealed an impending act of aggression by Russia, they haven't said anything and don't seem to want to come to grips with the fact that the nuclear exercise was also a mobilization for a real war, a potential nuclear war. And one of the
Peter, let me ask you about a couple of pieces of this because you've laid a very ominous table here. One of the things that you've described is the presence in the Russian nuclear warfighting capabilities of an ability to protect large numbers of at least leadership cadre, if not others among the population, from the effects of a nuclear strike by us in retaliation, presumably. I'm hearing that there are flights that are now moving large numbers of people from Moscow to the Urals, where some of the most important of those underground bunkers are. Um, to what extent does this fit into what you're talking about? Well, perhaps exercise or perhaps actual preparations for nuclear war fighting by the Kremlin?
That also fits into the paradigm of our denial of the nuclear threat, at least by the Biden administration, because they have characterized this transportation of probably Russian elites, as an exercise, when in fact it is probably not an exercise. It's probably a part of this mobilization to posture themselves to survive, fight, and win a nuclear war. The Urals are the location of some of their most important command posts. The Kozvinsky Mountain, for example, is a new General Staff command post that has been completed during the Russian era. These deep underground command posts are not all from the Soviet era. Russia has continued to dig in for fighting and winning a nuclear war. Yamantau Mountain is another one that's out there in the Urals, and it's a vast city-sized underground complex that also is impervious to nuclear attack. And we're not even entirely sure, have never been sure what its purpose is, except that it can accommodate, a population that's the size of a small city.
Dr. Pry, this is very ominous stuff on the leadership and defensive side. Tie that together with what we know about the other aspects of Russia's nuclear warfighting capabilities.
Before we leave the defensive picture, it also has to be mentioned that Russia has something like 10,000 anti-ballistic and air defense missiles in its inventory, which is vastly greater than the handful of national missile defense missiles that we have. The Russian strategic posture is also very different from ours. People think of the Russian triad as the same as the U.S. triad, but it is not the same. Theirs is, in fact, a polar opposite, because they are postured all the time for surprise nuclear attack in a posture called constant combat readiness, where they can launch their ICBMs, their intercontinental ballistic missiles, which include their ballistic missile submarines, which have ICBMs on them, in a matter of a few minutes. They're constantly ready to do that. So whenever Putin announces an increased combat alert and disappears into a nuclear bunker, we have to take deadly seriously that posture, the possibility of a surprise nuclear attack that in a few minutes could send hundreds of nuclear warheads, enough to basically take out the U.S. nuclear capability. The U.S. is not postured in that same way. We do not have multiple warhead ICBMs anymore, and they comprise the smallest part of our nuclear deterrent. Moreover, our nuclear forces are not modernized as are the Russians. The Russians are 90% modernized with their nuclear forces, and they exercise constantly for fighting and winning a nuclear war, including with Putin personally in charge, which is a rare thing on the U.S. side.
Very, very rare indeed. Peter Pry, we're going to have to take just a short break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Chinese threat, which we're now facing, and that of a few others, including one I think that's being greatly exacerbated by the United States government and its efforts to negotiate some deal with the Iranians. And then we're going to talk about what must we do about these various nuclear threats to prevent nuclear war from being fought and possibly lost by us. That and more straight ahead. We're back, and we are joined for a continued conversation about one of the most serious threats we're facing at the moment, nuclear war. With Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, one of our country's preeminent experts on this and many other subjects. Dr. Pry, you've laid out the challenges that we're facing from a Russia under Vladimir Putin that seems very prepared to fight, and I think they expect to win a nuclear war. China has for a long time been said to be a power that is satisfied to have a minimal deterrent. That has had to be revisited in light of recent revelations about the program that they are building with nuclear missile silos. Tell us what we know about China and the extent to which they too think a nuclear war can be fought and won.
Well, only China knows how many nuclear weapons and missiles they really have, because they have this thing called the deep underground wall, the Great Wall, the deep underground wall, which comprises 5,000 kilometers of underground tunnels where they could be hiding missiles, and it belongs to the Chinese equivalent of the Strategic Rocket Forces. So it's managed by their nuclear forces commanders. So it almost certainly includes missiles and weapons that are concealed from us. But this has not changed the view. Most of the assessments of the China nuclear arsenal over the years have been done by anti-nuclear groups. And the State Department has also wanted to believe, and the pro-China lobby has also wanted to believe that that having good relations with China has meant that they have not been developing a robust nuclear arsenal. And so for many years, there has been almost a consensus in Washington that China has only a small number of weapons, in the tens in terms of strategic weapons that can hit us, and maybe a couple of hundred tactical nuclear weapons at most. But other estimates have belied that. There have been other estimates by independent analysts, including by the Russians. Those estimates have largely been ignored, that have argued that China could potentially have thousands of nuclear weapons and hundreds of nuclear missiles, and hidden in this underground Great Wall, or just unaccounted by us. And those views have been ignored. Now it seems that even the mainstream view has changed, because over the summer we have detected hundreds of new ICBM silos being built in the desert of China. At least 350 is one of the numbers that's out there. Some of the numbers estimated have been as high as 400. And most people agree that this is probably for China's new ICBM, the DF-41, that carries 10 warheads. So that means that when these silos are completed, and they can be completed in a few years, they could field 3,500 warheads, maybe more, on just the DF-41 ICBM alone. I have calculated that by 2030, China could have over 4,000 nuclear weapons. They have the capability to make the weapons. They are clearly making enough delivery systems to deliver those weapons. The Defense Department has been reluctant.
So you put all this together, Peter Pry, and you've got, again, an image of a nation that is devoting resources to offensive capabilities and to protect those capabilities, as well as perhaps their people, all of which suggests a very deadly seriousness about this nuclear warfighting business. We don't have time really to do justice to other threats that are also emerging, whether it's from North Korea or from Iran, with our help, no less, in the case of the Iranians. But sufficient to say for the present purpose that we are facing a number of adversaries who have these weapons of mass destruction and have seemingly us in mind as their targets. Which brings us to the really serious question is, as you were describing earlier, we have neither a missile defense, despite Ronald Reagan 39 years ago saying that we need one, nor it seems a modern, robust, credible nuclear deterrent of our own. This is a formula, it would seem, for disaster, is it not? And if so, what would you recommend we do to try to change what's a dangerous situation, I think, at the very least.
Yeah, we have only a tiny missile defense in the national missile defense that can intercept less than 100 warheads. And it was never designed to protect us from a major threat like Russia or China or even North Korea, which has turned out to be a much more formidable nuclear adversary than our intelligence community thought it would be. Uh, our own triad is so obsolete. The delivery systems and the warheads themselves are more than 30 years old. They haven't been tested in 30 years. We've been just patching them together to make them work. Many of our scientists who designed those nuclear weapons are concerned about whether they would actually work after 30 years without testing, and the changes that have been made. What we have to do is greatly accelerate the modernization of our nuclear forces, both the weapons as well as the delivery systems, so we can catch up with Russia and China. But I think we're so far behind that it's an absolute imperative that we try to make a move on the chessboard to outflank these guys. And that is Reagan's vision of bringing back the Strategic Defense Initiative. I think that's what President Trump had in mind with the U.S. Space Force. Unfortunately, it's been diverted from that purpose. We could deploy an SDI system. It's untrue that SDI produced nothing. It produced one system called Brilliant Pebbles that was ready to be deployed under Bill Clinton. But Clinton didn't believe in strategic defense, and so he canceled it. Ambassador Henry Cooper, who's the former director of SDI, believes that system could be deployed in 5 years for a cost of about $20 billion. And perhaps it could be deployed even faster if we made it a Manhattan-type project and accelerated its deployment. That is urgently needed so that we can escape the trap of mutual assured destruction and adopt a new strategy for our country. I would call it strategic assured national existence, where our security is based not on destroying an adversary civilization, but on protecting our own people.
So instead of mad, we would have sane if Peter Pry were calling these shots. And Peter, I just want to underscore the fact that in addition to these other challenges, you've also been at the forefront for decades now of warning about the possibility that even a single nuclear weapon, if used in a very strategic way, could bring our country to its knees. Talk a little bit about the vulnerability of our electric grid to such an attack, what it would look like, and what we need to do about that.
This is an additional and important part of the United States strengthening its defensive strategic posture, which is to harden our electric grids and other life-sustaining critical infrastructures from both a nuclear EMP attack as well as cyber attacks, which would be done in combination. And before there is a nuclear war, we are even closer to a potential EMP cyber war from Russia, because they would try to win the game on the cheap and escape a nuclear retaliation by paralyzing us with a combination of an EMP attack, non-nuclear EMP weapons, as well as EMP weapons. An EMP is when you detonate a nuclear weapon at high altitude in outer space, so high that there are no blast effects or radiation effects or other nuclear effects that reach the ground. But it does generate this powerful electromagnetic pulse, which is like a super energetic radio wave that can destroy electronics across North America and paralyze our nuclear forces, even those which are hardened against EMP, because the Russians and Chinese and even the North Koreans have super EMP weapons that can generate field strengths higher than those to which our strategic forces and command and control systems are paralyzed. It, in effect, offers a way of winning a nuclear war without escalating to what most people think of as a classical nuclear exchange, where you actually have bomber bases and ICBM silos being targeted with blast and other nuclear effects.
Huge destructive effects. Peter Pry, we have to leave it at that for the moment. This is the subject to which we look forward to returning with you as a matter of the utmost urgency. Your clarion calls as to what we have to do in these areas is vitally needed, and we're appreciating your contributions to this program in that regard. Come back to us again soon, if you would. Ben Weingarten's up next. We're back and joined by one of my favorite people. His name is Benjamin Weingarten. He has been contributing mightily through a number of platforms to what I think of as the public policy debate on the most important issues of our day, and we're going to talk with him about a couple of them. He is a senior contributor to a terrific online resource, The Federalist, as well as a fellow of the Claremont Institute, one of the great public policy think tanks in our country. And he's always a welcome guest here. Ben, thank you for joining us. Welcome back.
Frank, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So much to talk about, and just a little bit of time to do it. Let's start with Iran and the deal that's evidently just about done. Details of it are dribbling out. What do we know about what the US government under Joe Biden has been doing, and what is the upshot of this effort to get a new uh, nuclear agreement with the Iranian mullahs?
I think simply put, Iran Deal 2.0 will be Iran Deal 1.0 on steroids. It appears that one of the major stipulations of this agreement will be removing the terrorism designation from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the jihadist army of Iran. Additionally, of course, this will flood the coffers of the mullahs, the lifeblood of the regime, including with oil money. And apparently, we will probably be paying for some of that oil to salve the oil really shortages that we've had when we were an energy independent country just a president ago. And to add to it, we see this burgeoning uh, Chinese, Russian, Iranian axis, and of course their proxies and partners, including in our own hemisphere. This deal was negotiated via Russia. So at the same time, the Biden administration calls Vladimir Putin a war criminal and he's cast as a modern day Hitler. The administration is using Russia as the conduit to execute this deal. And there are carve outs with respect to Russia, it appears, with respect to these oil deals that will be baked into the agreement as well. So we're effectively going to be paying for the privilege of, at very minimum, defending Iran's nuclear program again, and of course, enabling the creation of a bomb which could be proliferated and handed off to partners and proxies of the Iranian regime as well. And all of this has really been under cover of darkness. How often do you hear Robert Malley's name mentioned in the media, the person who is running point on this, a person who's been apologist for Islamists, Sunni and Shia, and worse, quite frankly, for decades now? That is who the Biden administration has entrusted with continuing the Obama Biden agenda of trying to create a solution in the Middle East, which will involve nuclearization ultimately and trying to again make Iran the strong course in the region.
Ben, that description seems to me to be a formula for absolute disaster on so many different fronts. Robert Malley, it should be recalled, was the perpetrator in chief, I think, of the first of these very, very unsatisfactory agreements. Donald Trump called it rightly, I think, the worst deal in history. To the extent that we're going to see a bomb emerging from Iran in short order, probably, the Israelis have said that's not going to be tolerated. Our government says it's not going to be tolerated either, but obviously they have every intention of tolerating it, in fact, enabling it. But the Israelis may be a different story. You follow closely Israeli government decision making. Do you anticipate they will take matters into their own hands? And if so, how do you expect the Biden team is going to respond by, at the very least, perhaps tipping off the Iranians that something's coming, or worse, perhaps actually interfering with an Israeli strike?
Well, on that latter point, I don't want to speculate at the specifics of what a U.S. response might be, but I will say that I think the analyses of the likes of Lee Smith and Tony Badran about some of the inside baseball around trying to pressure Israel over the Russian Ukrainian situation, I think does bear on this. It's very clear that the Obama Biden administration was hostile towards Israel, in many ways sought to kneecap Israel by leaking out intelligence about what it might do in connection with Iran's weapons programs and other malign activities. So I'm concerned, let's put it that way, about what the Biden administration might do to intercede to the extent that our strongest ally in the region feels it needs to act because of an existential threat. Now, setting all of that aside for a moment, I also want to make a point that I don't think has been emphasized enough, which is if the Biden administration believes this deal is so overwhelmingly in the national interest of America, why hasn't it committed to submit it to the Senate as a treaty? That's where the American people would be represented in this deal. And I think one of the most disturbing trends we've seen over the last 5+ years, and really well beyond that, is the idea that the people have no say whatsoever over the national security and foreign policy over the United States. And that's led to disastrous consequences for the people who actually bear the burdens of those policies.
Both with their tax dollars and often with their children or in their own right. Ben, this is a subject to which we will return with you, I hope, in the days very soon to come, because we are expecting this deal to be rolled out at any moment. And the answer to your question, as you know perfectly well, is this administration has no intention of sending this document forward to the Congress for, I think, formal approval. Certainly not by a 2/3 majority of the United States Senate, as a treaty would entail, any more than Obama did the first version of it. Shame on them. And it ought to be something that is used as an argument for cutting off the funding associated with this enterprise, it seems to me. Let me turn to a different topic, Ben. We're, of course, this week hearing about the views of the woman that President Biden has nominated to become the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Katanya Brown Jackson. I wanted to ask you about some of the things that she has said that are frankly very troubling to me. One, she professes that she hasn't really studied critical race theory and seemed to be saying she was mostly ignorant about it. She has clearly indicated that she's got sympathies at the extreme end of the left's views of the gender identity stuff by saying she can't define what a woman is. And then, not least, of course, have been the concerns that have been raised by, among others, several United States senators now, concerning her attitude and her rulings as a judge with respect to what I've always thought of as basically sexual predators, but we're now being told are just minor attracted persons. Does this sound like the kind of person that ought to be sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States?
This seems like the kind of person who wouldn't deserve to be elected dog catcher, let alone an academic in the kind of elite institutions that she comes from, including serving as the editor of Harvard Law Review. Look, soft on crime and soft on the most perverse of criminals, can't define what a woman is and defers, sort of tries to sidetrack it by saying I'm not a biologist. The most just a beyond absurd response. And of course, pleading the fifth in effect on critical race theory when she was a fan of Derek Bell, one of the leaders of CRT, and she's praised many of the CRT adjacent acolytes like Nicole Hannah Jones and beyond, and I believe serves on the board of a local school which promotes all manner of quote unquote anti-racist literature. It all strains credulity, but I think it is worth saying this. This is someone that Democrats believe that the president of the United States and his party and the progressive groups that dominate it believe ought to be sitting on the highest court in the land and ought to represent their view of what American jurisprudence ought to be. This is a feature of the modern Democrat Party, not a bug. This is not someone who is radical relative to the Democratic Party. This is someone who is in the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And that is Rubicon crossing. Yes, we have had other radical Supreme Court justices from the left, but to this extent, I'm not sure they would have been so open with it. But I think it's unavoidable because the record is so voluminous in terms of her rulings, her rhetoric, and beyond. This is who the Democratic Party is.
Well, it's interesting you use the term open, because I think one of the strikes here is that it seems as though she's being disingenuous in the course of this testimony. And I think despite her best efforts to obscure her views, her track record, her predilections, shall we say, she's, been uh, exposed by a number of these senators in their cross-examination of her. But the bigger question, which is really what I think you're getting at, is the judgment. And her judgment is that of an awful lot of people now on, well, what we used to think of as the radical left, but increasingly it's kind of the mainstream Democratic Party politics. And if this nomination were to translate into, a confirmation, heaven help us. The argument is, well, it's just a leftist replacing another leftist member of the court. She's no Stephen Bryan, that's for sure. But more to the point, I think, and we have to leave it at this, Ben Weingarten, I'm afraid, what she is espousing is the kind of thing that will radicalize the court, I'm afraid, because she will be championing it very, very aggressively, you can be sure. A mistake to be avoided. Next up, we're going to talk to Chuch DeVore, a very accomplished public policy practitioner as well as analyst about Ukraine and, not least, about the national security implications of the commander-in-chief playing for the other team. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm delighted to say we're joined by Chuch DeVore, a lieutenant colonel, United States Army Reserves, retired, who went on to a number of other very interesting and important roles, namely as a state assemblyman in California for 6 years, and now as the vice president for policy at a very important organization in in Austin, Texas, the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're delighted to catch up with him. He has been doing a terrific job on multiple media platforms, providing color commentary and analysis on Ukraine. And that's topic A with us today. Chuch DeVore, welcome to Securing America. It's great to have you with us, sir.
Great to be with you again.
Let me ask you to sort of level set with us on where you think things stand at the moment. Chuch, this is a dynamic situation, and as we talk, it may be a little different than it is when this program airs, but give us your sense of the lay of the land in Ukraine.
Well, I believe that the Russians failed in their campaign objectives in the very first 24 hours, and I said so as much in the pages of the Federalist and on Twitter. I said they failed because their initial campaign objective was to overthrow the government of President Zelensky, to have him kill or flee, and put in a puppet government. And they invaded then a large country, a country that I think excluding Crimea is a little smaller than Texas, some 45, 46 million people, with only some 200,000 troops. And that's just not enough to occupy a country where the country doesn't want to be occupied. That was number one. Number two, they invaded during the mud season, known locally as Rasputitsa. There was never a hard freeze in Ukraine this year, and as a result, the cross-country mobility was very difficult for the invading Russian forces. They were basically road-bound, and that became problematic because the Ukrainians had received enough training and had kind of known what was coming, that they did not engage the lead elements of the Russian vanguard. And what they did instead was wait for those resupply columns to avail themselves. And they were very vulnerable. And these Russian battalion tactical groups only carry enough food and water and ammunition and fuel for about 3 to 4 days. And after that, they're going to start running out of key supplies. And I don't care how well trained a tank crew is or how good the tank is. If it doesn't have fuel or ammo, or if the tank crew doesn't have food or water, it's not going to fight very well. And so that's what we're seeing now, some 4 weeks into this misadventure by the Russian forces. And the other thing I've been looking out for, and I think we're beginning to see it now, is because Ukraine seems fairly united against this Russian invasion. President Zelensky has been able to call upon a significant portion of the some 7 million people in the country that are fit for military service. In fact, you see these amazing videos of Ukrainian men kind of coming back from where they've been working in Western Europe to send remittances back home, and they're coming back home to fight. And that's certainly not any sort of an indication of a government that's about ready to fall or that has low morale. If that were the case, you'd see men heading the other direction, not running to the fight.
The question that occurs when you depict things that way is, does Vladimir Putin, who has a doctrine that treats nuclear weapons as just another weapon to be employed, and most especially to be employed when you wish to, as he puts it, escalate to de-escalate, that is to say, to win, that he may wind up using tactical nuclear weapons, maybe just a demonstration shot to try to break the spirit of the Ukrainians or decisively destroy what's left of the country, and accomplish that objective of reducing it to a subject state at best, and at worst, essentially eliminating Ukrainian sovereignty.
Yeah, so Frank, I think you have to look at this at both sides of the equation. In other words, you have to look at it certainly within the Russian command structure, obviously starting with Putin, and you have to look at it as to what effect it might have on Ukraine or on NATO and the world at large. I think it's important to understand that there is no button, quote unquote, that Vladimir Putin can push to launch nuclear weapons, right? There are other humans in the decision chain that have to carry that order out. And so then the question becomes, what sort of weapon might be used? Might we see, for example, in addition, the use of non-persistent chemical agents like sarin or blood agent? Of course, the challenge with those, unless they're being delivered by ballistic missile, is that it requires ammunition trains, just like hauling ammunition to the front that the Russians have had problems with. So back to the nuclear equation, yeah, they might try that. But if they did, what effect might that have on the Ukrainian will to resist? And frankly, I don't see the Ukrainian will to resist being bowed by that sort of terror strike. If, for example, you were to hit a place like Kharkiv, where you have a lot of concrete reinforced buildings and people are already sheltering in basements, what sort of casualties might be seen? 5,000, 10,000? Depends, of course, on how large the weapon is. Was it a ground burst, an air burst? What's the intent? I think, though, that the reaction from NATO and from the United States and certainly from the Ukrainians themselves is not going to have the desired effect that Putin's looking for. And what I'm most concerned about at this stage of the conflict is that Putin seems to want to widen the conflict by bringing in Belarus. And this is a very reluctant partner. And the problem with doing that is Belarus is already a very unstable country where a lot of the leadership doesn't appear to want to be in this fight. So if that were to happen, Putin might end up with one of his best allies out of the picture.
Chuch, I think you've described the problem that we're facing, the problem that Vladimir Putin is facing very well. And I guess the question is, we'll just have to wait and see which of these outcomes eventuates. Is he going to up the ante? Is he going to skulk away? Is he going to bring in Belarus? Is he going to bring in more troops? All of this is to be determined. And unfortunately, none of it is going to be good for the people of Ukraine, who, I think you agree with me, are part of the free world. And we do have an interest in whether or not they are going to survive this punishment and be able to rebuild their country, which I very much pray will be the case. Chuch, we're going to take a brief pause. When we come back, I want to turn to another issue that's weighing on a lot of people's minds, I think, and that is the degree to which our commander-in-chief and his administration have been compromised by our mortal enemies, the Chinese Communist Party. That and more, straight ahead. We're back. We're continuing a conversation that I think is extremely timely with one of our favorite folks. His name is Chuch DeVore, out of the Texas Public Policy Foundation at the moment, a former military officer in the United States Army and state assemblyman in California. Chuch, one of the things as a military man, most especially, I know you have a very highly attuned sense of are threats to the national security, including in the intelligence domain. Counterintelligence being, it seems, more and more a lost art. I wanted to get your thoughts about a problem that is becoming, I think, increasingly evident, and that is that Joe Biden, the President of the United States, the Commander in Chief of our armed forces, has been deeply compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. Hunter Biden's laptop provides a wealth of evidence, and more of it seems to be coming out by the day. To the extent that that is so, how serious a problem do you think that is for America's national security and other vital interests?
Frank, I think we've had this problem building in America for some 25 years. I was sounding the alarm on the People's Republic of China way back in the late 90s when, of course, we were trying to have a permanent most favored nation trading status, China into the World Trade Organization, World Bank, et cetera, et cetera. And and the problem is
On the theory that if we just made them richer, they would become
right,
more like us. So
right,
engage away, right?
right. And so, Frank, the problem is that all of our elites have been subject to this capture, and it's most especially a challenge at the executive branch level in our form of government, because the executive branch is supposed to be where you get your energy, your unity of command when it comes to national security, foreign affairs, military affairs, and of course Congress secondarily because it's the policy-making branch and the appropriating branch. But we've seen all of our elites have been subject to this capture. When I was in the state legislature in California, for example, it was constantly, you'd see this constant stream of Chinese funded trips for state lawmakers going to Shanghai and Hong Kong and Beijing at the invitation of the Chinese Communist Party, because they knew that in California, where our legislative districts are so vast, that many of those people were going to go on to Congress. And in fact, many of them have. My former Republican leader in the state House is Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader. And there are probably at least 10 people I served with who are in Congress right now, many of whom had all expense paid trips to China. So I think this is a significant problem. And the best solution to it, of course, is public pressure. We need to shine the light on this so that people who may not want to do the right thing are compelled to do the right thing. I think you saw this in Germany, where the new chancellor was very reluctant to provide any sort of assistance to Ukraine. And then you saw this massive protest and support among the German people for Ukraine. And you saw the leadership in Germany kind of reluctantly deciding to follow their own people. And I think that we need to do something very similar here.
Yes. This is, as you say, not confined to the political elite. Our financial sector is a particular problem in the sense that it has been, as you know, Chuch, for, well, uh, I would argue probably quite some time, but certainly since May of 2013, when Joe Biden helped engineer a memorandum of understanding between the United States and China that gave Chinese companies preferential access to our capital markets. They didn't have to conform with our
Right.
laws and regulations concerning transparency and
Right. No
accountability, for
transparency at
example.
all. All the books are
Yeah.
cooked.
When you look at the migration of immense amounts of money, tens of, well, trillions of dollars at least, possibly seven or eight of them, this is a huge problem in its own right in terms of underwriting that threat. But just to stay with your point about the political elite and the elite in California in particular, it seems as though a specific focus of effort for the Chinese has been recruiting people in the San Francisco Democratic
Right.
machine. I'm thinking about Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein and Eric Swalwell and others. To the extent that this has been going on, yes, for some time, but it's now come to pass that I think the scales are dropping from our eyes that enriching the Chinese is doing nothing but making them more capable as an adversary and more bold, that they can use their various forms of power, their unrestricted warfare against us. So again, the question occurs, if that's all taking place, what must we do besides just raising awareness that it's happening and encouraging public outrage against it?
Well, again, there needs to be very specific steps taken. For example, if in assuming that Republicans gain control of the House and the Senate in the November 2022 elections. Let me give you one just very recent example that's very troubling. The Securities and Exchange Commission is now going to require publicly traded companies to consider climate change as one of the factors that they have to report on. Now, as you properly pointed out before, will this apply to Chinese corporations? And if so, what degree of certainty do you have that it's nothing but a check the box drill? Because of course that's what it's going to be. And then you have BlackRock.
Check the box for them.
Yes,
much
exactly.
more
Exactly.
burdensome on us.
Then you have the largest financial management firm in the world, BlackRock, that is advocating for this and is just had, as I recall, a $1 billion private placement in China just in the last week. So this is very clearly going to disadvantage U.S. jobs, U.S. industry, and advantage those jobs in the People's Republic of China. And I also think it's important to look for common cause with some of our fellow Americans who may be on the left. You know, you mentioned both Senator Feinstein and Speaker Pelosi. Well, Pelosi, interestingly enough, is not too dissimilar from other people on the far left in that she often cares or has talked about, for example, Tibet and other aspects of China's abysmal human rights record. And this is certainly something that I believe we need to work with because she's not wrong on that. And so I would argue that at least between the two most senior California lawmakers at the federal level, that there probably is a bit of a division where Feinstein seems to be unabashedly doing things that favor the Chinese regime, where at least Pelosi has some degree of nuance and some criticism.
I fear that may not be the case as much today as it was in the past. But you're right that every effort has to be made because this is a problem for all Americans.
Yes, it
is. Isn't just Republicans or Democrats. Chuch DeVore, this is a topic to which we hope we can return with you very soon. Thank you for your time today and for your leadership at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thanks to the rest of you for joining us at Securing America. We appreciate you doing so. I hope you're better equipped to help us do just that, and that you'll check out securingamerica.tv for more on what you can do, and then you'll go forth and multiply.